I really like looking up at the sky. I think it's very interesting to see what's going on. And especially this morning, I was looking at that moon and I was like, man, it's just so beautiful.
Beautiful.
And that just reminded me one of the first times I met a really close friend of mine. And we were outside and there was a beautiful full moon. And he goes, this is the first time I ever met him. He goes, man, I can't believe we've never been there. And I was like, what? And that was my first time ever talking to this guy. And I was like, dude, what are you talking about? And so that was pretty funny. But
yeah, way to break the ice.
you're right, exactly. That's a good way to start a conversation. So that was a good. And so every time I see that full moon, every time immediately the first thing I think of is, man, I can't believe we've never been there. But it's pretty funny. But anyway, joining us right now is Stephen Cox. He is actually a writer, a journalist for LifeSite News, and a frequent writer for Catholic Vote, and who we check their site pretty much every single day. So good morning to you, Stephen Cox.
Thank you, Adrian, for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Praise be to good. It's good to have you on. It's really interesting. People would say, okay, he's a journalist for LifeSite News, a writer for Catholic Vote. What is the book that he would write? St. Alphonsus Liguori. So why St. Alphonsus Liguori?
It's a great question. Just to quickly correct something there, I haven't written for Catholic Vote for a number of years, but I've done a number of things for them in years past. But as a full-time journalist at LifeSite, you'd think maybe writing something about maybe something more controversial, but St. Alphonsus Liguori, why him? Well, because he played such an immense role in really my reversion to the Catholic faith in my late 20s. I'd fallen away from the church, as many young people do. I'm sure you know people who this has happened to, and you get into the world quite a bit. But I came back to the faith fairly quickly in my 20s, worked for the Archdiocese of Chicago. That was then under Cardinal George. And in my late 20s was wanting something more with my faith. I had discovered the Latin Mass and really wanted to get deeper into spirituality. And I started just by chance, happened to discover St. Alphonsus's books. My roommate had them at the time, and I had never read him before. And I figured, well, this might be the right saint, I think, to kind of get me on the path to rediscovering my faith, and it turns out it was. So
amen. That's beautiful. And I mean, I think there's many such cases. Many people will say very similar things about finding the traditional mass and finding these saints that have kind of been lost and rediscovering them. A very beautiful thing. Now, this book is really interesting because you kind of have it broken down into different sections. And I was reading the section on prayer, and what particularly stood out to me is your section here about St. Alphonsus being a lover of music. And that's interesting because you kind of have this impression of some of these saints, especially people like St. Alphonsus Liguori, who you kind of get, most people will read him and like, oh, he's the moral doctor of the church, very like, no fun. You're not allowed to have fun. No nice things. But St. Alphonsus was actually very musically talented. Tell me about this.
Oh, absolutely. His father raised him. He was the oldest of 7 children, and he had tutors in an array of subjects in his youth. He received his canon and civil law degrees at just 16. He was a master harpsichordist in his youth, and it was a habit, in fact, that he put away when he got a little bit older. As a youth, he also enjoyed going to the theater. He wore glasses, but when he went to the theater, he would take his glasses off, close his eyes, and would really just enjoy what he was listening to. So when he became a priest, he did put that a bit aside, but he also understood that music has a special impact on souls, and so he actually would compose hymns, over 50, when he went on his missions in the Italian countryside in the Kingdom of Naples. So he would sing. He was a performer of sorts for those who he preached to. He would sing to the religious nuns that he would also give conferences to, and he also in private played the clavichord. So he was very talented. He would sing hymns to Our Lady instead of going to recreation or doing something else that would have been more relaxing. Instead, he spent his free time as a priest and bishop composing hymns to Our Lady. And so he understood well the importance of music on the soul. And it was a very impressive individual. Again, wrote over 110 books in total in his lifetime, pamphlets, treatises, things like this. And hymns were a part of that for sure.
Yeah, and one thing about the hymns, I don't want to belabor the point too much, but I do like this idea because we live in an age where music is so bad. it's just all bad. But we have a natural love for music, and we want to have good music so badly that we make compromises and say, well, that music's not that bad, and so you give ourselves excuses to listen to it. And I just mourn and yearn for this kind of music that exists, that is beautiful, good, true, and not base. What's your thought about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the first things I did after reading St. Alphonsus, and it's a very simple thing, but it would never occur to me at the time. I turned off my car radio, and I relished the silence. St. Alphonsus says silence is so important for the soul. And instead, I started praying instead on my drive home from school. I was a instructor at community college in the area here, and I would just zone out on my way back from work. And I realized, wait a second, this is valuable time, and I need to be doing something with this time that glorifies God. And so I began to listen to classical music, and I began to discover all the great songs of the past, the hymns of a past. And it was a really much better use of my time. And Saint Alphonsus also again understood that again music uplifts the soul. He actually composed a very famous hymn that's still around today, Adrian. It's like one of the most famous hymns in Italy. If you go there today, they still sing it. It's called
Wow.
"From Starry Skies Thou Comest." It's like the Christmas carol in the entire country of Italy, and Andrea Bocelli still sings it at Christmas time. So he made that much of an impression in the 1730s, 40s, 50s, and it's his best song is still known in Italy today.
Wow, we should get somebody to do a very good poetic translation of his hymns and get him into English. That would be a great task for somebody to do. We're going to go to a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk about religious life because we are in need of priests, and more importantly, in my opinion, religious. And Alphonse Liguori was a man who preached religious life. So we're going to talk about that when we come back with more Catholic Drive Time right after this. Don't go anywhere. We'll see you very soon. And welcome to Catholic Drive Time. This is your host, Adrian Fonseca. It's so good to be on with you today. Praise be to God. It is always good to be here, especially on Catholic radio. Joining us right now is Stephen Cox. He's the author of St. Alphonsus for the 21st Century, a Handbook for Holiness. I have it right here in front of me. If you're watching online, you can see it. And if you're watching online, you can actually leave a comment down below on YouTube, Facebook, Rumble, and interact with us directly. So join us online if you are able to. We'd love to hear your comments. It'd be a great conversation to have. Now, Mr. Stephen, it is really interesting about religious life, and I want to jump into the conversation about religious life. But before I do, I just have to ask: do you know if Alphonse Liguori, considering today is Michaelmas, wrote anything about Saint Michael or had anything to say about the angels?
That's a great question. I'd have to actually probably buy some more books of his. There's so many that have been written in Italian that haven't been translated. He has written things about angels. I don't include them in this book per se. There's a volume two coming out, so around Christmas time, maybe I'll be able to fit something like that into the next volume. But yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I was thinking about that. I'm always curious about the people who have saints who have written about the angels. It's just very beautiful. I think Saint oh man, Alphonsus, he wrote a good book about the angels, and just something good to meditate upon. But the religious life. Speaking of angels, angels here on earth, the religious, at least they should be, is a very beautiful thing. Now, tell me, this chapter on religious life, I love the way you broke it down because you kind of start off with the considering a vocation, your own kind of journey here, implementing it through here with Alphonse Liguori, and then you kind of end on a great place, which was it's kind of funny because I was having this conversation literally yesterday about what the standard of a priest must be. I was talking to a friend and they were saying, hey, look, priests are humans. We can't expect them to be perfect. And I'm like, St. Alphonsus might disagree with that statement. So what say you? Tell me about this chapter on religious life.
Yeah, actually, he does. So in this regard, he does actually say something about the angels, but in comparison to priests, and he says a priest gives greater honor to God than the angels, and not just the angels, Adrian, but the Blessed Virgin Mary as well.
Whoa.
Now that's a big statement, all right. And when people first hear that, say, how could that be? Mary's the mother of God. She bore Christ in her womb. Saint Alphonsus actually says it's due to the fact that priests offer Mass in reparation for sin. And then they also forgive sins in the confessional. And these two things, Mary or the angels could not do by virtue of what they are. The angels cannot forgive sins. Mary cannot confect the sacrament of the Mass. And so these two things are very unique about the priesthood. And St. Alphonsus says by virtue of that fact that the office of the priesthood is greater than the angels, the priest must not pollute his hands. If he's going to be the medium, the vessel through which God comes down to the people, he has to live a spotless and a spotless life. And he gives a number of bullet points through it, and I put them in the book, Adrian, as you've no doubt mentioned here. There's a number of things. Priests need to deny themselves the pleasures of life, their preferences, sometimes their favorite food. St. Alphonsus put bitter herbs on his meals to deny his palate. Instead of going out for recreation, as I mentioned, he would go and spend time with the Blessed Lord in the Eucharist, and he would find very wholesome things to do, like compose songs to Mary. So there's a number of things that he did, and it would be a total self-denial as opposed to what we're seeing today.
And it's interesting as well because the Saint Alphonsus was a founder of religious orders, and I think this is interesting to think about. Considering, I mean, we have this distinction between a religious priest and a secular priest. Tell me about these the religious orders that he founded in relation to this.
Yeah, so he founded the Redemptorist order. This was an order of missionaries, if you will, in 1732. After a nun, Sister Maria Celeste Crostarosa, she had visions of him actually several years before, of him founding the priestly order that he founded. And eventually there was doubts about her visions, but they eventually were overcome. And she founded the Redemptoristine nuns first. So God worked through her to found the nuns order first, and then the next year worked through her to start the Alphonsus order. And their focus was the most abandoned souls in the Italian countryside, and throughout the kingdom of Naples. So Naples and the Papal States were actually divided. Unity in Italy was not yet forged at the time, again 1700s, and so his order was one that did fairly extreme penances. Saint Alphonsus himself disciplined his body with sharp chains and other forms of fasting on Saturdays in honor of Mary. And he did a number of other penances as well. Throughout his life, he wore pebbles in his shoe, it's believed, to cause discomfort. And so their focus really was going to preach missions to the peasants in the Italian countryside. And all of their missions always included sermons on the four last things: death, judgment, heaven, hell, as well as sermons on God's mercy, though. They did not forget to do that. And then also on Mary. So there was a number of things that they focused on, but those are the primary ones.
Now, another aspect of the Redemptorist order, and one of my favorite things about them, and I've heard a few Redemptorists preach. There's a group of traditional Redemptorists that I've heard give preaching in the past, and their preaching is just absolutely amazing. I was absolutely just taken away by their preaching because it's so simple, but at the same time incredibly profound. And it just blew my mind. And I still remember one of the things that he said, he repeated over and over and over again, and it actually stuck to my memory, was he said, "Life is short and death is sure. The hour of death remains obscure. A soul you have and only one. If that is lost, all hope is gone." And I still remember it. I still have it memorized now. So tell me about the preaching style of St. Alphonsus and its relationship there.
That's amazing. Yeah, Redemptorists are expert preachers, and it comes from St. Alphonsus. St. Alphonsus always said he did not preach a sermon that the little old lady in the back of the church couldn't understand. He actually revolutionized preaching at the time. It was very much opposed to simplicity, and it was very highly verbose and very complex. But he made it simple because he understood where the people were at. He had to meet the people where they were, as a matter of prudence, to help them where they were living and what the situation was in their life. So he explains that preaching should not be overly affectatious, not histrionic, or as we unfortunately I think see today, so many priests walking up and down the aisle and raising their hands left and right, and making all these eccentric behaviors. But St. Alphonsus said, keep it simple, keep the head direct, use simple words, and get to the heart of the matter. Make a couple points. Don't be overly long, but not to be overly short either. He says you have at least 2 or 3 points on every sermon. Drive that home. And again, he would sing in his sermons, and I think as you prove to the fact that this priest who you heard gives a little bit of a rhyme in some of these his delivery, it very much helps. And that's I think the mission of the Redemptorists when they preach. As per St. Alphonsus, it's very simple, direct, but also very memorable because of what they preach about. And St. Alphonsus did that, and the fruits are obviously still bearing fruit.
Now, the last thing I want to talk about in terms of religious life before we move on is the question of discerning a vocation. And this is always a good topic because we need people to try to we need priests, and more importantly, in my opinion, we need religious. So tell me about this in terms of discerning a vocation.
Yeah, so he says a lot, and there's a lot in this book, not just for laity, but again, as for those who are discerning religious life, vocation to the priesthood, lay brothers, as well as nuns. As I said, a nun sort of indirectly founded the Redemptorist order, and St. Alphonsus would often write and counsel the Redemptorist nuns throughout his life, and he would also write to lay women. He would say, consider the lot of married women. Their time is spent in the chaos of the private home. They have their husband to tend to, their children, their in-laws. Very little time is allowed for married women to be with God. And so he would always encourage young women. In fact, one of his nieces, he actually successfully persuaded her to pursue life in the convent. And he said, if all women knew the beauty of life in the convent, there would barely be any married women. And so he made that point very much to lay women. But he also said in general, Adrian, that 1 in 3 children, okay, have a vocation in some way, shape, or form. So 1 in 3, that's a lot of priests, brothers, etc., that we're missing out on today. And he would very much again remind young men to say, hey, when your death and judgment comes, will you look back at your life as giving yourself entirely to God? Do not neglect the graces that He's giving you to pursue this. And he again was very kind and very thoughtful to the brothers that he had in the Redemptorist order. And there were several brothers at the end of his life who cared for him very much. He was sick for many years throughout his life, but the last 5 or 6 years were very, very difficult on him. He suffered from scruples, and 2 brothers in particular tended to him every day. And it's believed that they underwent the sort of martyrdom with him because there were so many things that were going on in his life that he needed help with. He had a bit of a temper, nothing too untoward, but was not always easy being around him. And these brothers, it's a very beautiful life for people to pursue as well. So he understood. He was a bishop too, Adrian. So he understood the entirety of giving oneself to God, either in the convent, either as a brother or as a priest or as a missionary, like the Redemptorist. So he is someone, again, as a doctor of the church, we can look to for advice on almost every issue. In fact, he's written so much that it's believed
Now,
he did not touch
what
on
would you
not one thing.
what would you say about parents? Because I feel that a lot of vocations are lost because parents don't encourage it, or sometimes they even discourage it, and they're like, "No, I don't want my kid to be a priest or a nun." What would you say to parents who their kids may have a vocation?
Yeah, you got it. Well, St. Alphonsus would say that parents who dissuade a young person from pursuing a vocation sin in 2 ways. They sin against piety, they sin against charity. Okay, so the obligation of parents is to look out not just for the temporal well-being, okay, making sure they get the right food, making sure they're getting a good education, but primarily their spiritual well-being as well. And if a child has a vocation, that vocation belongs to God. The parent should not be dissuading that. In fact, they should be actively encouraging that. And unfortunately, I think the case is today that we are, I think maybe intentionally, dissuading children from knowing the great saints of the past, the Ten Commandments, and knowing Scripture, and instead we're putting in front of them television, sports, and smartphones instead of reading what we really need to do. And St. Alphonsus has a bunch to say about parents and their obligation to children and how they can do that. It's in the book, St. Alphonsus for the 21st Century. But he also says, and I'll end with this, Adrian, he says, parents will be held for all the sins of their children. Okay, so at judgment, it'll be the parents who answer for that. So sort of a scary thing to think about, but I think a very sobering thing. So um, everything else is in the book. Check it out. There's more to it than that. He
Yeah.
says, parents, discipline your children, raise them in the faith. and they'll be the ones who keep it as they get older.
Amen, amen. And we didn't even get a touch on spiritual warfare. We didn't talk about Our Lady. We didn't talk about sin. There's a lot more to cover. Definitely a book I very much enjoy. St. Alphonsus for the 21st Century by Stephen Cox. Check it out. You can find it anywhere good books are sold. St. Alphonsus for the 21st Century. Look it up. Thank you very much, Stephen Cox, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Go to Amazon.com. You can look it there, and find me on Twitter at Stephen Cox.
There you go. And that's going to do it. We're going to head into our second hour. If you can join us, praise be to God. We'll see you in just a moment. We're going to talk about monarchy coming up in one moment.